you have songs that go off of the Bible and you have lessons that come from the Bible, it's so easy to pair them up. Guess how we can see the victory? By looking at tonight's lesson. Examples of a steadfast faith. We have the ability in our lives to see so many great things and wonderful things, and tonight kind of look at the idea of faithfulness, but in a little bit different manner. It's not so much of a, this is how you do it, or these are all the common verses we look at. Kind of like I mentioned this morning, it's a little bit different view of it by looking at the examples that are set before us. The Bible gives so many great examples, and we're going to start in the Old Testament with a couple of examples here that we know about, but kind of dig a little bit more into them of some of the hardships and the influences that they had by having that steadfast faith, by remaining faithful. And then we'll look at some things in Christ's time, and then we'll wrap it all up. So starting off, we're going to go into Daniel, and be in the book of Daniel for a little bit if you're following along in your Bibles with it. But first off, as we start thinking about it too, just being aware that there are numerous passages that do tell us how to build the faith and how that should be. We have, I guess to start off, we will use one of those verses, Hebrews 11 and verse 1. What is faith? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. When we take things by faith, we are taking it that we have enough reasonable information to see or believe that it's true, whether we can see it or not physically. So when we look at some of these instances, these people may or may not have actually seen these things or experienced them in its entirety, but they know that they're there because of their history. So to even go further back into a study of why Daniel and these other men here, we look at Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I can never remember their original names because we know them more as, even though Daniel got the name of Belshazzar, he still gets called Daniel all the time. I guess when it's your book, you call yourself what you want to call yourself. But then the others we typically know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which was not their original Israel name. It was actually the name given to them for their in Babylonian captivity. Which kind of brings us to some of the idea and the background of these men is that the nation has been brought into captivity. And as such, the king of the conquering nation has now said, bring children and young men, train them up to be of my service. And so that is where we begin and start to look at, as we look in Daniel 1, running about 8 through 16, we see this idea that as part of this training, not only does the king say to train them up, but he also talks about, here is a portion of my food. Now, how many different gods do they worship? How much do they worship themselves as the kings? All of these things play an effect, and we see that, without knowing all the history, because when Daniel starts looking at this, he says, I will not defile myself with this food. With the food, with the drink, with the different things that are there. He says, I am not going to defile myself from this. And understandably so, the chief servant that is in charge of helping train them, put yourself in his position that if you have a couple that say, well, we're not going to do that, well, you're getting a voluptuous feast. You are getting all this stuff. If you don't grow and you start looking scraggly, I'm on the line for this one. This is now getting into my territory of I'm concerned for myself. Because the king's going to look at me and say, why are they not performing as they should? But he says, test us 10 days. The 4 of these guys are together. They say, test us for 10 days to see if we fare any worse. And then do with us as you wish. Okay, so you've just given me an out. If in 10 days you don't look really good, then you're on the program or you're out of the program completely. But they looked better after the 10 days than the other children and young adults. Imagine that one right there being, how bold the faith, and we see that as being, they were a child or of young age. So to be that young and to have that kind of a faith, do we do that? Look at Daniel in that, in verse 8 he says they would not defile themselves. But if we go backwards, we see where it says that and I didn't mark this, so that's my fault on this part here. Okay, I'm going to have to read each verse to find it now. In the previous verses, it talks about them being children or of young age. So when we look at this, we can see that they are not full-grown adults. They are being taught in the ways and the languages and in all things. And, we do see that where, the younger children pick that up easier. But we see the faithfulness and how steadfast they are. Now, what about all the others that were brought into this captivity, into this service right here for the king? But we see these four right here standing up in their faith for what they believe. And we see that they were able to succeed and to be of great focus with that. And through this, they stood up for their beliefs. They stood up for what they believed. Each time they stand up for God, for their belief, we can also see in the scriptures here where it shows that they increased in favor. They increased in favor with this person that was over them to train them and make sure they were good. And they fared even better than the ones getting all this extra food, and they're just eating vegetables. This isn't doing well for me, boasting that I am not a vegetarian. But they were able to do very well. But it was, I think, more not so much what they were eating, but why they ate what they ate. They did not eat things that were sacrificed to other gods or to the other things. They did not defile themselves with the things that the Israelite was not to eat. They said, I am staying true to my God. And God blessed them for that. As we continue to look at their lives at the king's decree, a little bit later on in Daniel chapter 3, we get to the point where we see that he created this golden image. And at the signal of all these different trumpets and different musical instruments and things, every single knee was to bow before this golden idol and before him to worship or face the furnace. This is where Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego really get their limelight in our knowledge base of the scriptures, because they did not fall before that idol. And when the king asked him about it, he says, King, we will not bow before any other god. Because the king even said, to these three men, I will give you another shot. I did not witness it. I will give you another chance to bow your knee. And they said, King, there's no need. We will not do it. Imagine saying that to the king. So he already had a punishment set out, which was anyone who did not, they were to take and be thrown into the fiery furnace. But because they wouldn't even do a second chance, they wouldn't buckle at his command, he ordered that furnace to be stoked up even hotter than normal. Mighty men of valor were to grab these men and chunk them in. And when they did, they died because of how hot it was. But as we look in chapter 3, verses 19 through 27, we see the effects of this. We see what happens when he was full of fury. He sent them in. But once they were in there, they see these three men had told him, King, do as you believe, as you see fit. We will not be harmed. And they weren't. When they took and were in there, all of a sudden a fourth figure appeared, and they credited as one as of the Son of Man. How would he know that? How would he even have that inkling or that idea about how it looked or what it was like? But yet we see one like the Son of God with them. And when they came out, they had not a single marking or evidence of being in the fire. Having worked in firefighting and doing some of that, when you go into a smoking house, even if you're just on the after effects of it in your gear, and you come back out, even though I was wearing all the outside protective gear, I take all that off, I still smell it. They didn't even have the smell of smoke. They didn't have any singed hairs. The only thing missing were the things that they bound them up with. They wrapped them up in ropes or whatever they used to wrap them in and threw them inside. They didn't have a scuff from the fall of landing. They didn't have any of those. And we see the faithfulness towards God. Verses 28 and 29. We see what Nebuchadnezzar sees. This is the one who threw them in there in the first place because he made a golden idol. He was to be worshipped. And this is what he has to say about it. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God." Notice that which ones are capital and lowercase. The capital is the actual God of the Bible, but the lowercase are their gods that they make up. They would not worship the made-up gods, but would worship their true God. "Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or language that speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces. Their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this." And then verse 30, the king promoted the three again. So from going to making a decree that you will worship my idol, to these men standing up before him saying, "No, sir, we will not." Throw them in the furnace. And they walk out without a scratch. He opens his eyes to the God of the Bible. They didn't have the Bible then, but of the Israelite nation. The steadfastness of three men caught the king's attention. The one who just made the decree that all were to worship him and his idols and his gods said, "Okay, nobody speak bad against their God, ever, at all. And if you do, then you'll be punished for it." That's a big turn and a big shift and a change of what was going on. Then we go back to Daniel and we see his faithfulness, the way that he goes. It was noticed and tested. It was also targeted. I didn't put that word down there, but thinking about it, it was very much targeted as well. When we go up, fast forward up to Daniel chapter 6, we start to see a shift of power about to happen. They're about to restructure government a little bit. And in this, there's a little bit of power hungriness of a couple people that they want that prominent position because they see that Daniel's about to get it and they want it instead. And so there was no fault found in him. They tried to pull up some dirt. What do politicians do? If they want something bad and they want to go forward in life, even some people do the same thing. They want to find some dirt on somebody to get ahead of you. They tried to do this to Daniel and they couldn't find a thing. He has no skeletons in his closet. And so in that is a testament itself of his faithfulness. So instead they go around the back because they know how devout Daniel is. So this is where they test him and they focus on him, is that they request the king to make a law that any person who prays or focuses towards any god or man for 30 days should be punished, should be thrown into the lion's den, and do it in such a way that you can't change it. And the king did it. He didn't think about Daniel. He didn't think about Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, but we've had a new king now. It's no longer Nebuchadnezzar. It's now Darius. But yet he takes and he signs it off. I approve this. Make it so. And so for 30 days at least, they take and watch Daniel, because it said it had to be for 30 days period. And so he continued. He went to his house. The windows were open, and he knelt down and bowed 3 times a day, every day. Before this decree, after this decree, up until the point that he gets called in. And he does it. He still does it, even though he knows about this new law. So they bring it before the king's attention here, and he says that, King, you said this right here. You signed this law into effect, right? Don't you just love it how they remind him that the law that he just signed in first? Well, your servant, Daniel, is doing this. And the king says, oh no, not Daniel. I don't want to throw Daniel in the lion's den. I don't want to do this. But because the way that they did it, he can't change his mind. So he throws him in the lion's den. And we're familiar with this. What happens? It's a peaceful night. Except for the king. King's stomping back and forth, pacing and trying to figure out what he's going to do. But Daniel just goes there and sits down with the lions. No fault was found in him, so that is how he survived. When the next morning came, he says, Daniel, are you there? I'm here. Don't worry. There was no fault found in him. So King Darius honored God and punished those who accused Daniel and set him up. Threw them in there with their families, and before they could hit the ground, they were torn to pieces by the lions. So it's not that the lions weren't hungry. But Daniel had no fault in him. He showed a steadfast faith throughout his life. He showed it every step of the way. He had his faith and trust in God. Do we do this in our lives? Is this how we focus ourselves? As we look at other examples, we can look into 1 Samuel chapter 17 and see the confrontation between David and Goliath, where David was sent to the camp to bring food and provisions and check on his siblings and bring word back. But in the process, ended up going up against the giant of the other camp, of the Philistines. And with a single rock took him down. The reason he could do it with a rock was because he, as David said, God is on our side. Why are we so afraid? Why are we not taking action? We have God. What else do we need? The day that David got to the camp, something that we don't always think about, or I've missed on some of the details of the story, the day he showed up to camp, they were all gearing up for battle. They were about to hit the battlefield until Goliath stood up front and said, hey, what y'all doing? Then they all ran back to camp and cowered. Okay. Paraphrased version, but they were all afraid because they forgot that God was on their side. We can look at Joshua, how he demonstrated his faith. And I've got 2 of those instances written down here. Once was that when he was a spy, along with, when they took one person from every tribe and sent them into the promised land before it was theirs to scout out the land. They came back talking about how big and grand this place was, how wonderful it was. But 10 said that these people are too big, we are going to be slaughtered, there's no possible way we can do this. But 2, Joshua included, said, this land is rich. This land is amazing. This land can be ours by just walking over into it because we have God. He held his faith. And then as we go forward, we can fast forward into Joshua 24 where when the nation was wavering and such, we see this very commonly quoted thing about Joshua. Choose you this day who you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers in the lands of captivity or the God of the nation. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He had no wavering. He had no doubts. He had no questions. He was asking them, why are you wavering? The nation was questioning. A lot were questioning, and he said, why is there a question in your mind? Joshua stood by his faith. He stood strong in his faith. As we continue to go forward into the New Testament, we see where Christ was sought out by several. We see the faith of these few. And I've purposely taken ones that are only a couple of verses in length. I'm kind of actually, what I'm seeing a pattern in myself is right now is I'm kind of working through the book of Matthew a little bit. And I'm not discouraged by that. I'm actually encouraged because I'm starting to look at some of these things like this right here. These few examples right here are small verses that sometimes get overlooked or read by quickly. But think about the steadfast faith that these people, without a name, have to offer to show us. How strong is their faith in what we see about this? Because we see them seeking out Christ for a very specific purpose. They knew in their hearts exactly what could happen. They looked at Christ. They have heard about him going around and teaching. And so we see right after the Sermon on the Mount, when he finishes, we see a couple of examples in chapters 8 and 9. We see a leper who comes to Christ and says, if you will, if you are willing, you can make me clean. How much faith, if we had a major medical issue and we had Christ about to walk in front of that door, we walked out to meet him, how would we ask for that? How would we ask for help? Please heal me if you can. That's not a very faithful statement. Asking Christ to heal us if he can is doubting whether he can do it or not. This man knew that he could do it. He said, if you are willing, you can make me clean. A very definitive and strong argument that he is saying, I know that you can do this if you are willing. He's not demanding it to happen. He's asking for it to happen if it is Christ's will to do so. And because of that, he was clean. As we continue down on starting verse 5 through 13, we see a centurion seek out Christ. This is a man on the other side of the coin. He's not an Israelite. He's not a Jew. He's not part of the people that Jesus is actively speaking to at this moment. But he comes to Christ. He comes and says, please heal. He says, I'll come to you. He says, I'm not worthy. All you have to do is say it, and I know that it will be so. Imagine that. If we go to Christ and say, will you please heal someone for me? They're back at home. A lot of times today we do that. The doctor will either say, come to me, or back in the day they would actually do a house visit. The visit's not necessary. I know that you can do it. All you got to do is say the word. The faith that this man had to have had, he's not even a member of the nation that Christ is speaking to, but yet he gives all this information and has that faith. So much so that in verse 10, Christ says, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. The faith that this man had in seeking him out. A paralyzed man was brought to Christ in chapter 9, verses 2 through 8. Christ looks at all of them and saw their faith in verse 2. Jesus saw their faith, not just the paralyzed man who said, please bring me to Christ, but also to the friends who believed the paralyzed man and helped carry him there. They were all commended for their faith. We have a ruler whose daughter had already died, and was seeking out Christ. He left the home, all the sorrows, all the family members, left the house, went to Christ. Will you revive my daughter? And Christ walked in and did so. It's one thing that he's been healing people, but now all of a sudden he's even raising people from the dead. This person had no doubts about it. He went and said, My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live. He didn't say that out of his grief or out of his sorrow. He said that out of his faith. We know it was out of faith because Jesus went and it was done. In the middle of that account right there from in chapter 9, verse 18 through 26, there's a break in the middle. On the way to the house, we see another instance. A woman with blood for 12 years said, all I need to do, if only, verse 21, if only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well. I don't even have to see him. He doesn't have to say a word. All I have to do is this. And Christ said, your faith has made you well. These people had such faith, such a steadfast faith that it led them to being able to do great things. It led the Daniel with his 3 friends there, able to be of great power and great authority within that kingdom, even though they were the nation that was enslaved. They were able to stand to get up to the king, not against the king, but up to the king about his decisions about worshiping other gods. And they stayed true to their own. We see each of these instances. One question we can ask ourselves, well, a series of questions right here. If we were there, if we were in that position, would we have wavered in any of these situations? Think about the camp up against Goliath. Would we have stood up and gone forward saying, we can do this? Or would we have been behind that tree over there along with everybody else fighting for a spot where we didn't see them? Would we have been so focused in our faith to accomplish what they did? Would we have been the one putting our foot one in front of the other, continuing forward saying, God has already given us this. God can do this. Or maybe are we a witness to the events? Would we have witnessed the faith of each of these and the others around them and seen how it affects the lives? Would we have been like those 2 kings that took and gave the decrees to go do whatever you would like, but make sure that you do it unto me, but you broke the rule. I try to give you a punishment, but yet you come out untouched. What about some of these others that the healings that Christ did, the things that were given or done, would that have made an impact in our lives? To have witnessed that. Maybe we weren't the one that was standing around having that faith, but they saw it. We saw what happened. As we think about these things, and as we want to look a little deeper, like I said this morning, I did a whole sermon on love without going to the love chapter of 1 Corinthians 13. Today I've done this evening a full lesson on faith without ever talking about the faith chapter. To see what we kind of consider the honor roll of faith, looking at Hebrews chapter 11 would be a great study to go back to and to kind of study more and look at other people. Those are kind of the big names that we look at sometimes. We focus on those, but what about everybody else? But the bigger question is, what about us? The more important question of if we were there is what will we do? What are we going to do today? Will our faith be steadfast, leading us towards righteousness as each of these people did, as each of these examples were? Do we stand up for what is right even in the midst of what is wrong? So many are doing what is wrong each and every day, pushing that agenda, promoting it time and time again. If you don't believe it, just turn on the television. There's a reason that some of us only watch 2 channels, and sometimes not even 2. It's so hard to find righteousness, find people with a steadfast faith today. We need to help show people it can be done and encourage them and help them to do the same. Combine the two lessons from today. This morning's about love, this afternoon's about faith. Is our faith strong enough to love other people and help them to build their faith, to help be steadfast in the faith of God? I pray that it is. I pray that we're able to take and continue to go forward each day, become stronger ourselves, and to help reach out to others around. If your faith is wavering or needs any assistance, we invite you to come while we together stand and sing.